Crimson Shadows. Chapter 1. The Discovery. Ethan Hayes stood back, wiping his paint-streaked hands on a rag, studying the canvas before him. The latest in his series of dark, haunting landscapes, this one depicted a dense forest at twilight. Shadows loomed in every corner, and in the midst of the trees, a figure barely discernible seemed to melt into the darkness. His brush had danced across the canvas for hours, and as the last stroke fell, Ethan felt an odd sense of completion, almost as if the painting itself were alive. He'd felt this before, a strange connection to his art, but this time it was different, more intense. A shiver ran down his spine, the room suddenly cold despite the summer heat outside. Ethan took a step back, his gaze fixated on the figure in the forest. It was a trick of the light, he told himself, nothing more. But even as he tried to dismiss the unease, a nagging thought kept circling in his mind. That figure, it wasn't part of the original idea. It had appeared almost of its own accord, unbidden, as if his hand had been guided by something beyond his control. He glanced at the clock. It was nearing midnight. He decided to call it a night, but as he turned to leave, his phone buzzed on the table. He hesitated before picking it up, the eerie silence of his studio broken only by the faint hum of the city outside. The message was from an unknown number. It read, "Turn on the news." Curiosity piqued, Ethan switched on the small television in the corner of his studio. The screen flickered to life, showing a live broadcast from a crime scene. A dense forest filled the screen, police tape stretched between trees, officers combing the area with flashlights. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as the camera panned to a figure lying on the ground, partially obscured by the underbrush. The newscaster's voice was a distant murmur in his ears as the image on the screen aligned perfectly with the painting behind him. The same forest, the same shadows, and the same figure, now a lifeless body sprawled among the trees. He dropped the remote, his mind reeling. How was this possible? He had painted that scene just hours ago, yet here it was unfolding in reality. The police were investigating a murder, the newscaster explained, the victim found mere hours ago. There was no suspect, no motive, just a body in the woods. Ethan felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. His hands trembled as he looked from the TV to the canvas, the realization dawning on him with chilling clarity. His painting had predicted the murder. Chapter 2. The Connection. Sleep was impossible. Ethan spent the night pacing his studio, the television replaying the news coverage on a loop. Each time the camera zoomed in on the crime scene, his stomach churned. The forest, the shadows, the lifeless body, it was all too real, too identical to his painting. The more he thought about it, the more he felt an invisible noose tightening around his neck. He pulled out his sketchbook, flipping through the pages. Each one contained a different scene, each darker and more sinister than the last. He stopped on a sketch from weeks ago, a cityscape at dusk with a figure standing at the edge of a rooftop. A chill washed over him as he recalled the news of a man who had jumped to his death from a building downtown, just days after he'd drawn the sketch. His mind raced, connecting the dots. There was another, a drawing of a lone car on a desolate highway, headlights in the distance. A few days later, there had been a car accident on that very road, with no witnesses to explain how it had occurred. Ethan felt sick. He had brushed off those incidents as coincidences, but now, with this latest painting, he couldn't ignore the pattern. Somehow, his art was tied to these deaths, as if his creative process was being manipulated by something, or someone, dark and malevolent. He needed answers, but where to start? He couldn't go to the police, not without sounding like a lunatic. Yet he couldn't just sit back and do nothing. The victims, whoever they were, deserved justice. But what if he was somehow responsible? The thought gnawed at him, each unanswered question deepening his dread. As dawn broke, he made a decision. He would visit the gallery where his work was displayed. Perhaps there was something or someone there that could shed light on what was happening to him. By the time he arrived at the gallery, the sun was fully up, its light cutting through the morning fog that clung to the streets. The gallery was quiet, almost eerily so, with only a few early patrons wandering the halls. Ethan made his way to the back where his collection was showcased. The paintings hung in a neat row, each one meticulously framed, their dark themes drawing the attention of anyone who passed by. But today they seemed different. As Ethan approached, he noticed subtle changes in each piece. The shadows were darker, the figures more defined, as if they were creeping closer to the viewer. His heart pounded in his chest as he inspected each one, looking for signs of something, anything that could explain what was happening. That's when he noticed it. In the corner of one painting, almost hidden by the swirling darkness of the scene, was a small, barely noticeable symbol. A circle with an eye in the center. It was faint, something that could easily be missed if one wasn't looking for it. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He'd seen that symbol before. But where? As he stared at it, a memory flashed in his mind. A book, ancient and worn, with that same symbol on its cover. He had come across it years ago in a dusty corner of an old bookstore, its pages filled with strange rituals and dark histories. He had thought it nothing more than an odd curiosity at the time, something to spark his imagination. But now it seemed to hold the key to the mystery that was unraveling around him. Before he could dwell on it further, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Hayes?" Ethan turned to see a man standing behind him, dressed in a sharp suit, his expression unreadable. "I'm Detective Carter," the man said, flashing a badge. "I need to ask you a few questions about your latest work." Ethan's heart sank. The noose was tightening. Chapter 3. The Interrogation. Ethan followed Detective Carter into a small, windowless room at the back of the gallery, his mind racing with every step. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing him in with a man who could very well be his judge, jury, and executioner. Carter gestured for Ethan to sit at a plain wooden table, then took the seat opposite him, his eyes never leaving Ethan's face. The detective's gaze was piercing, as if he could see right through Ethan's defenses. "Mr. Hayes, you're aware of the murder that occurred last night?" Ethan nodded, swallowing hard. "I saw it on the news." Carter leaned forward, his voice calm but laced with suspicion. "And you're also aware that the crime scene bears an uncanny resemblance to your latest painting?" The question hung in the air like a blade poised to strike. Ethan's mouth went dry. He knew this moment was coming, but he hadn't prepared for it. He was caught between the truth that sounded like madness and a lie that might condemn him further. "I didn't know," Ethan said finally, choosing his words with care. "I mean, I didn't know when I painted it. He faltered, searching for an explanation that wouldn't make him sound insane. "It was just a coincidence." Carter's eyes narrowed. "A coincidence? You painted a scene of a murder that happened hours later, in exact detail, and you expect me to believe that's a coincidence?" Ethan struggled to maintain his composure under the detective's scrutiny. I don't know how it happened. I paint what comes to me, that's all. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." For a moment, Carter said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Mr. Hayes, this isn't the first time something like this has happened with your work, is it?" Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. "What do you mean?" "The rooftop suicide," Carter said, his voice steady. "The car accident on the highway. Both scenes you drew in your sketchbook before they occurred. And now this. That's 3 deaths connected to your art." Ethan felt the room closing in on him. He wanted to deny it, to push the truth away, but there was no point. The detective knew everything and there was no escaping it. Carter continued, his tone softening, almost as if he felt sorry for Ethan. "I don't believe in coincidences, Mr. Hayes. There's something going on here, something more than just your talent for painting. I need you to tell me what that is." Ethan's mind raced, flashes of memories and images swirling together in a chaotic blur. The symbol in the painting, the book with its strange rituals, the feeling of being guided by something outside of himself, it all pointed to a dark force that had latched onto him, using his art as a conduit. But how could he explain that to Carter without sounding insane? How could he make the detective understand that he wasn't a murderer, but a pawn in a game he didn't even know he was playing? "I don't know what's happening," Ethan said, his voice trembling with the weight of his fear. "I swear, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. But there's something I can't control. It's like my art is cursed." Carter's expression remained skeptical, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, curiosity perhaps, or the slightest hint of belief. "Cursed? By what?" Ethan hesitated, then decided to tell the truth, no matter how unbelievable it sounded. "There's this book, an old one. I found it years ago and it had these symbols, rituals, strange histories. I thought it was just a curiosity, something to spark my imagination, but now, I think it's connected to what's happening." Carter leaned in closer, his interest clearly piqued. "This book, where is it now?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "I lost it a long time ago. But I think the symbol in my painting, it's from that book. And whatever it is, it's using me." The detective was silent for a long moment, weighing Ethan's words. Then he stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "Mr. Hayes, I need you to stay available for further questioning. And don't leave town." Ethan nodded numbly, relief and dread washing over him in equal measure. As Carter turned to leave, he paused at the door, looking back at Ethan with a mixture of suspicion and pity. "Whatever you're involved in, Mr. Hayes, it's not over yet." Chapter 4. The Search. Ethan couldn't stay in his studio. The walls felt like they were closing in on him, each shadow a reminder of the darkness lurking within his art. He needed answers, and the only place he could think to start was the old bookstore where he'd found the cursed book all those years ago. The store was tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city, its facade as worn and weathered as the tomes it held within. As Ethan pushed open the creaking door, a musty scent of aged paper and dust greeted him. The shop was as he remembered, dimly lit, with towering shelves crammed with books of every size and description. He approached the counter where a gray-haired man with wire-rimmed glasses sat, engrossed in a book of his own. The man looked up as Ethan approached, his eyes sharp despite his advanced age. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice gravelly from years of disuse. Ethan hesitated, unsure of how to begin. "I'm looking for a book I bought here a few years ago. It had a symbol on the cover, a circle with an eye in the center." The man frowned, clearly trying to recall. "We get a lot of books through here, son. You'll have to be more specific." "It was old, really old," Ethan pressed, desperation creeping into his voice. "It had strange rituals and symbols, almost like a grimoire. I think it might have been cursed." The man's eyes widened slightly at the mention of a curse, and he leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "Ah, I see. You're talking about the Codex Maleficarum." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Yes, that sounds right. Do you still have it?" The old man shook his head slowly, his expression turning grim. "I sold that book to you, didn't I?" Ethan nodded, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The man sighed, rubbing his temples as if trying to erase a bad memory. "That book has a dark history. It was said to be written by a group of occultists who believed they could control fate through art and symbols. Anyone who used it risked being consumed by the forces they sought to command." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. "And now it's happening to me. My paintings, they're predicting deaths. I need to know how to stop it." The man looked at him with a mixture of pity and concern. "Stopping it won't be easy. The Codex is tied to you now, through your art. The only way to break the connection is to destroy the source." "How do I do that?" Ethan asked, his voice tight with fear. The old man hesitated, then reached beneath the counter, pulling out a small leather-bound journal. He handed it to Ethan, his expression serious. "This is the Liber Victim, a book of counter-rituals meant to bind and suppress the powers of the Codex. You'll need to perform the final ritual at the place where the first death occurred, the forest from your painting." Ethan took the journal, his hands trembling. "And if I don't?" The man's eyes darkened. "Then the curse will continue and the deaths won't stop. Eventually it will consume you too." Ethan nodded, clutching the journal tightly. He had no choice, he had to break the curse before it was too late. As he turned to leave, the old man called after him. "Be careful, son. The forces you're dealing with are not to be underestimated." Ethan didn't reply, his mind already racing ahead to what he had to do. He knew the place, the forest from his painting, the site of the murder. It was there that he would confront the darkness that had taken hold of his life. And it was there that he would either break the curse, or be consumed by it. Chapter 5. The Ritual. Ethan arrived at the forest just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky awash with deep crimson hues that bled into the gathering darkness. The towering trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches intertwined overhead, casting long eerie shadows across the forest floor. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, but underneath it all, there was something else, an almost tangible sense of foreboding, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. Clutching the Liber Victim tightly in his hands, Ethan ventured deeper into the woods, guided only by the faint light of the rising moon. Every step felt heavy, each crunch of leaves underfoot echoing in the oppressive silence. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the shadows themselves were closing in around him. Finally, he reached the clearing, the very place depicted in his painting where the first murder had occurred. The memory of the news broadcast flashed in his mind, the lifeless body sprawled among the trees. He forced himself to focus, pushing the horrific image aside. He had a task to complete and there was no turning back now. Ethan unfolded the journal, its brittle pages crinkling in the cool night air. The final ritual was detailed in an ancient script, the words a mix of Latin and an older, arcane language that Ethan barely recognized. The instructions were clear. The ritual needed to be performed at the exact location where the curse had manifested, and it required an offering, a piece of art created by the cursed. He placed the journal on the ground and pulled out the rolled-up canvas he had brought with him. It was the same painting that had predicted the murder, the image of the dark forest and the shadowy figure now staring back at him as he unfurled it. The sight of it sent a shiver down his spine, but he pushed the fear aside and began preparing the ritual. According to the Liber Victim, he needed to destroy the painting as part of the ritual, to sever the connection between his art and the death's. Ethan gathered dry twigs and branches, piling them into a small pyre in the center of the clearing. He placed the painting atop the wood, the figure in the forest now almost seeming to watch him with unseen eyes. Ethan took a deep breath and began to chant the incantation from the journal. The words felt strange on his tongue, foreign and unsettling, as if they carried a power all their own. As he spoke, the air around him seemed to thicken, the temperature dropping rapidly until his breath came out in visible puffs. The forest around him grew darker, the shadows deepening until it felt as if the night itself was pressing in on him. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like a chorus of distant voices, and the flames of his makeshift pyre flickered wildly. Ethan's voice trembled as he neared the final verses of the incantation, the journal shaking in his hands. The shadows at the edge of the clearing began to move, swirling like ink in water, creeping closer with each word he spoke. Then, as he uttered the final phrase, the wind suddenly died, and the forest fell into an unnerving silence. The flames of the pyre shot up, engulfing the painting in a sudden blaze. Ethan watched as the canvas blackened and curled, the image of the forest and the figure disintegrating into ash. But something was wrong. Instead of feeling the release he had expected, the air around him grew heavier, the darkness closing in. Ethan's heart raced as he realized that the shadows weren't retreating. They were advancing, coalescing into a form that rose from the ground where the painting had burned. A figure took shape, tall and gaunt, with eyes that glowed a malevolent red in the darkness. It was the figure from his painting, now standing before him, no longer a mere image but something far more terrifying. Ethan stumbled back, the Liber Victim falling from his grasp. The figure loomed over him, its presence oppressive, suffocating. Ethan could feel its malice, its hunger, as it reached out a skeletal hand toward him. "No!" Ethan cried, scrambling to pick up the journal. The ritual was supposed to end the curse, not summon this thing. But the figure moved with unnatural speed, its hand gripping Ethan's wrist with a strength that belied its bony appearance. Pain shot through Ethan's arm, icy tendrils snaking up his body as the figure's grip tightened. He felt his energy draining, his strength waning, as if the very life was being sucked out of him. Desperate, Ethan reached for the only thing he could think of, the lighter in his pocket. With trembling hands, he flicked it open and ignited the flame, thrusting it toward the journal still lying on the ground. The flames caught the edge of the pages, quickly spreading through the brittle paper. The Liber Victim began to burn, and as it did, the figure let out a piercing, inhuman shriek that reverberated through the forest. Ethan's vision blurred as the darkness around him intensified, the figure's grip loosening as it seemed to weaken, its form flickering like a dying flame. The pain in his arm lessened, and with a final burst of strength, he pulled free, stumbling backward. The figure writhed in agony as the flames consumed the journal, its body dissolving into smoke and shadows that dissipated into the night. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, the darkness retreating as the fire died down, leaving only the smoldering remains of the Liber Victim and the ashes of the cursed painting. Ethan collapsed to the ground, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. It was over. The curse was broken. He had survived. But as he lay there, gasping for breath, a single terrifying thought crossed his mind. What if this wasn't the end? Chapter 6. The aftermath. The days that followed were a blur. Ethan returned to his apartment, a shell of the man he once was, haunted by the events in the forest. The Liber Victim was gone, reduced to ash along with the cursed painting, but the memory of what he had seen, what he had felt, lingered like a dark cloud over his mind. He stopped painting altogether, too afraid of what might come to life on the canvas if he did. His once vibrant studio now stood silent, the easels and brushes gathering dust as he withdrew from the world around him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. The police visited him several times, Detective Carter chief among them, pressing him for details about the ritual, the book, and the murders. Ethan told them everything he knew, but his story sounded insane even to his own ears. The detective seemed to believe him, or at least he didn't push the matter further, perhaps realizing that there were forces at play that he couldn't understand. Still, Ethan couldn't escape the gnawing guilt that plagued him. 3 people had died, their lives intertwined with his art, and he had been powerless to stop it. Even now, he wasn't sure if he had truly broken the curse or simply delayed the inevitable. One night, as he lay awake in the darkness of his room, the shadows on the wall seemed to move of their own accord, shifting and twisting into shapes that shouldn't have been there. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to breathe to calm the panic rising in his chest. "It's over," he whispered to himself. "It's over." But deep down he knew it wasn't. The ritual had stopped the curse for now, but the darkness had left its mark on him. It was a part of him now, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. The following week, Ethan received a package in the mail, unmarked and anonymous. He hesitated before opening it, his heart pounding with a sense of foreboding. Inside, he found a small, ornate box made of polished wood. It was heavy, its surface etched with intricate designs that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. With trembling hands, Ethan lifted the lid. Inside was a single rolled-up canvas, tied with a black ribbon. His blood ran cold as he realized what it was. A new painting. He didn't need to unfurl it to know what it depicted. The image was already seared into his mind. A new scene, a new death waiting to happen. Ethan dropped the box, stumbling back in horror. He had thought the curse was broken, that he was free. But it wasn't over. It would never be over. The darkness had found him again, and this time, there would be no escape.